When Russia invaded Afghanistan, we didn't ask what's the best option for Russia. The best option for them is to get out. You know, they have no right being there, so the best option is to get out. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, we didn't ask what's the best option, like how should he deal with that. But when the West invades another country, all the values shift. The only question that arises is what's best for the aggressors. Well, that's an interesting, it's a sign of the deeply rooted imperial mentality, which of course goes back centuries and virtually dominates the intellectual and moral cultures. But in the case of Iraq, we should recognize principles that we automatically accept when someone else is guilty of a crime. Aggressors simply have no rights. They have responsibilities, but no rights. The primary responsibility, as holds of Britain in the United States, is to pay massive reparations for the crimes that they've committed. That includes the invasion, of course. It includes the murderous sanctions regime. The directors of the UN Oil for Food program, distinguished international diplomats, both resigned because they regarded it as genocidal. It includes support for Saddam Hussein through his worst atrocities, long after the end of the war with Iran. In fact, even after the first Gulf War, when President Bush the first authorized Saddam to crush the internal rebellions that probably would have overthrown him. Well, massive reparations are certainly called for. Second responsibility is to hold the guilty accountable. And the third responsibility is to pay attention to the voices of the victims. And we have a pretty good sense of what they are. It doesn't enter into debate. So if you look at the presidential debates or the discussion of the options, one voice is missing: Iraqis. And it's not that the voice is not heard. The Pentagon in December released its latest study of focus groups all around Iraq. And it presented its report as an optimistic report. It said there's good news. Iraqis have shared beliefs. So there's hope for reconciliation, contrary to what is said by people who think that the sectarian violence is out of control. And look down and see what the shared beliefs are. The shared beliefs are that the United States is responsible for the sectarian violence and the other crimes, and that the invaders ought to pull out and leave the country for the Iraqis. That's the shared beliefs. That's the good news. Well, that position does not enter into discussion in the West. It's reported, but it's forgotten, because it doesn't matter. We run the world. We own the world. We decide what's best. I can have my own opinion on what we ought to do. Others can have their own equally uninformed opinions, including the CIA and military intelligence. But what matters is what Iraqis want. And we should give them the opportunity to construct policy. By Iraqis, I do not mean the government that is established in the highly protected, heavily protected U.S.-run green zone. Yeah, it's there, but that's not the voice of Iraqis any more than the government that the Russians were protecting in Kabul in the 1980s was the voice of Afghans. So those are the responsibilities. From then on, we have to follow those obligations. I don't think there's any good solution for Iraq at this point. The United States has, it's kind of interesting to see that although Americans and Europeans do not accept the principles that they profess, Iraqis do. When Iraqis attribute responsibility to the invaders for the murderous sectarian violence, they're simply following the principles of the Nuremberg Tribunal. The Nuremberg Tribunal quite explicitly defined aggression in terms which, of course, trivially apply to the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq, and went on to say that aggression is the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes, in that it encompasses all of the evil that follows. Well, in the case of Iraq, that means it encompasses the sectarian murderous sectarian warfare, the ethnic cleansing, and so on. And Iraqis accept that. They accept the Nuremberg principles, as the Pentagon study shows. Americans and Europeans don't accept that. We don't accept that we, the aggressors, are responsible for all the evil that follows. And that, again, is a reflection of the imperial mentality. We can profess principles, but they only apply to others, not to us. We should live up to those principles. I should mention, finally, that the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Justice Robert Jackson, American prosecutor, had some eloquent words that he addressed to the tribunal. He said, we are handing, this of course is the tribunal that tried the worst Nazi war criminals. It said, we are handing these defendants a poisoned chalice, and if we sip from it, if we are ever guilty of similar crimes, we must accept the same judgment, or else we are declaring the trial to be a farce. Well, European and American opinion tacitly is that the trials were a farce. It's not the first time. Iraqis probably don't know it, but they in fact are accepting the Nuremberg principles. We should think about the possibility of living up to our own professed ideals, which means applying them to ourselves. It could be a very different world if we did that. Same would be true about, let's take the next, with regard to Iraq, Iraqis and knowledgeable correspondents, like say Nir Rosen, who's followed it very closely from the beginning, they often describe the American-British invasion as comparable to the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. It's not clear that there is any solution for Iraq. The only question is, what's the least worst solution at this point? Nobody has a positive proposal as to what to do. But it's up to Iraqis to determine it.